I swear to God, I must be taking crazy pills. It feels like I am. Okay, let's talk about this. Did you guys see the press conference yesterday? Dana White is asked by MMA Junkie's Mike Bond if there's going to be $300,000 bonuses, post-fight bonuses, for this card because it is, in fact, UFC 300 at the UFC 300 press conference. And Dana White says yes. And jubilation was to be had in the audience and certainly online. And I noted on Twitter, though, that, like, listen, don't get me wrong. I didn't quite say it this way. I'll put the tweet up. You can judge for yourself. It does read more negatively than I intended it. But listen, this was my point. It was like the reports on the gate from Sports Business Journal are that the gate, by just alone, is going to be the third highest gate in UFC history at that venue, $16.5 million. Just on the gate alone, they can pay the entire athlete costs, plus these bonuses, and still have money left over. And people lost their mind over this. Guys, can we please, I'm begging some of you to please think past stage one. Now, first of all, this does make me something of a raging hypocrite because just yesterday I'm like, it's time to move on from fighter pay, and for the love of Jesus Christ, I can't even believe that I have to make a video like this, but here we are, and I have to make it, so I might as well. Folks, this was my entire point about this. Is an extra $250K, right? Because the bonuses are normally $50K, so we're going to add $250K on top of that. Is that a good thing that the fighters are going to be getting this? Yes. Yes, it is. Okay? I'm not saying extra money is bad. In fact, let me be very clear about this. Am I in any way saying that this is bad, that the money is going to fighters? No, I am not. Just to clear that up. But understand something about the math here. If the previous bonus, the standard bonus, is $50K, and now you're handing out $300K, and you usually hand out, typically this does change sometimes, and so the math might change a little bit on this one, but typically there's 4 performance bonuses that are handed out. It used to be fight of the night, which would go to 2 fighters, and then KO of the night and sub of the night. They got rid of some of the naming convention, but it's still basically fight of the night, and then 2 of the other ones they want to award. So there's typically, not always this way, but almost always this way, 4 extra bonuses handed out afterwards. If we're going from $50K to $300K, that means it's a difference of $250K, which means times 4, it's basically adding $1 million to the payroll. Now, one more time, is adding $1 million to the payroll something to just say is terrible? No. Is it a good thing? Yes. I understand that. But guys, you got to have a mentality where you're not stepping over $1 to pick up a nickel. Do you think that $1 million extra on payroll is a lot of money to the Ultimate Fighting Championship? It is not. It is not at all. This is why I brought this up. I swear I got to stop talking about fighter pay. I really have to. A, I'm a raging hypocrite, and B, this thing is just driving me nuts. Guys, why do you think Dana White didn't hesitate when he was asked about this? Because $1 million extra in event payroll is the buzzing of flies to the Ultimate Fighting Championship. Do you know how much they made in revenue in 2023? $1.3 billion. That's just last year. They made nearly $300 million in the last quarter alone. There was a 43% jump in live event revenue, which comes from the gate, as well as site fees. So various locations paying them to show up somewhere for whatever sum of money that they negotiated between the two parties. And we all know some of the story there, right? They're doing more Apex shows, which means they go on the road. They're driving the ticket prices up. Ticket prices for the pay-per-views have been high, but it's resulting in these enormous gates. Guys, an extra $1 million is nothing to be mad at, but begging the promoter for an act of generosity for money that arguably should be more evenly distributed is so a backwards way of looking at it. Imagine something for just a second. Imagine that everything else about fighter pay stayed exactly the same, except for whatever reason, some law was passed, whatever, where they had to split the revenue evenly for the live gate. That's it. Didn't have to share on event sponsorship. Didn't have to share on sponsorship overall. Didn't have to change anything about how they do pay-per-view distribution. Didn't change anything about how they do the fight kits themselves. Nothing. The only thing that got changed in the industry, or even just for this event, was they had to split the gate 50-50. And by the way, in boxing, this is quite common for your A-list fighters, certainly. That would result in $8.25 million going to the fighters, which would be over 8 times what you're seeing from this bonus. And that's just off this one thing. I'm not talking about what would happen if they got half of the television deal, which the NBA does. Do you understand how much money there would be if they got half the television deal? It'd be $750 million extra going to the fighters. This is my point. Yeah, sure. Is it great to get an additional $1 million introduced into the payroll for this event? Of course it is. But this is low-hanging fruit. This is just begging the promoter who controls the entire industry, has all the leverage in every way, which we've described 8 million times at this point, doing a thing where they don't have to do, but that's not where the real money is. The real money is in getting a deal to share sponsorship. The real money is in getting a deal to share TV revenue. The real money is in getting a deal to share gate receipts. That's where the money is. So I understand that there's like this fervor of enthusiasm for the card. You guys have not heard me say nearly anything bad about this card. I love this card. And in fact, when people were sort of bitching about it, I thought it was kind of crazy. Not to say it's a perfect card. No card is perfect, but okay, in general, I don't understand the complaining. The card is amazing. I cannot wait to watch it. And one more time, is it good that they're introducing an additional $1 million to the payroll that they don't ordinarily have to introduce? Yes. But for a promoter that controls the entire industry, that doesn't have to share sponsorship rev, that doesn't have to share live gate receipts, that doesn't have to share television money, an additional $1 million for this one event, because it's not a permanent thing, to the UFC is chump change. It's nothing. That's very easy for them to do. That's why they can make calculations like that about it. So forgive me if I'm not like, oh my God, that's the most incredible thing I've ever seen. It's cool. It's cool. It's not bad. But I just don't understand. I'm like, you guys realize that's not where the money is, right? And just kind of waiting for a hand-me-out and begging for it. That's actually not where the money is. The money is in all the other places that no one wants to do any of the work to actually get. This is why I have to stop talking about this issue, because it is so fucking abundantly clear at this point that everybody, fans, media, sponsors, promoters, broadcasters, everybody likes it the way that it is. It doesn't matter what evidence you introduce. It doesn't matter what points you try to make about it. It doesn't matter when you're like, well, why are you guys celebrating this when you could have been doing more? For example, with a union. If you had a union, you probably could demand a share of the gate receipts. You probably could demand through collective bargaining any number of different things that would vastly increase pay over just waiting for this. It's the craziest thing I've ever seen. But it's a perfect encapsulation of the debate around fighter pay, which is why, again, I'm a raging hypocrite on this. I've got to stop. I've absolutely got to stop. It's getting me nowhere. It's getting the sport nowhere. Nothing is working about it. Utterly unconvincing to the audiences it's supposed to be convincing to. And the fighters themselves, they prefer it this way. They prefer to wait for handouts from the promoter rather than take matters into their own hands and form a union or any other thing. They prefer this. So far be it from me to stand in the way of it. Now, there is one interesting matter we have to talk about, which is what it might do in terms of incentivizing and promoting action. And on this one, I'm going to be a little bit more agnostic. Here's why. If you're, for example, Arman Tsarukyan or Charles Oliveira, where what you gain if you win is a title shot, potentially a title itself if you can get down there. In other words, this door, a win at this juncture, opens to you much more than $300,000, right? And it's a 3-round fight, so you don't have the same kind of margin for error in certain circumstances. I'm less convinced that $300 is going to $300,000, I should say, is going to compel someone in that fight to act all crazy and just go completely flat out bonkers. It's certainly possible. We have to see. I don't know, but I'm not as convinced it'll happen in a scenario like that. On the contrast, or I should say, on the contrary, a fight like Renato Moicano and Jalen Turner or Bobby Green and Jim Miller, you might see something like that there. You certainly might, and that would be a big boost to their fortunes. I would imagine those guys don't make necessarily, huge dollars anyway. $300,000 might be a really big boost to them. And again, if you're Renato Moicano or you're Jalen Turner, losing would not be great, but it would not necessarily be the end of the world. You could see it going to them. The only part about that is kind of a weird rub is if you look at who statistically gets awarded performance bonuses, it tends to, not always, certainly there are plenty of counterexamples, but it tends to go more towards main card fighters. Now, this is UFC 300, where it's stacked in ways that are just crazy. As I mentioned, the opening bout on this card is between two former champions, so maybe that won't be in play here. My only part is, do I believe in certain bouts that the 300K could very much incentivize someone to really go for it, really potentially even act quite reckless, but nevertheless pursue the fight despite the consequences and may emerge victorious or otherwise, potentially not? Yes, it could be a very motivating factor. I do think that is worth taking seriously, but we have to wait and see. And also, just because a fight is exciting, disentangling that from, if you're on the 300 card, Renato Moicano is already an action fighter. Jalen Turner is already an action fighter. They would have to go above and beyond what we normally see of them for us to really declare we saw clear evidence that this was an incentivizing factor, or we'll have to hear from them afterwards as well, I suppose. So I'm going to remain agnostic on that. I certainly account for the fact that it is very possible we could see it, but I just don't know exactly how it's going to play out, and I think it's going to really compel, Zhang Wei Li to really go for it. I'm not convinced that that's really true. Max and Justin, even if the bonuses were exactly the same, do you think they wouldn't step on the gas? They probably would. So I think it's going to have an incentivizing factor, but it might be uneven and in some cases hard to tell. Or perhaps these guys are all going to go out there like absolute maniacs, top to bottom, and you're going to be completely overwhelmed by it. And it could be this entire experiment on what level you have to get to with bonuses to really incentivize action. On that thing, I'm actually quite interested to see what happens. I think that part of the conversation is actually pretty helpful. It's just the one about, oh my God, look at this incredible largesse. It's a nice thing. It's a super nice thing. But that ain't where the money is. The money ain't in Santa showed up on Christmas, and aren't we all glad he was very generous this year? That's a nice thing. That's a good thing. It's maybe even a great thing depending on who the fighter is. But it's not how you get the real money in this industry, and the fighters have flatly rejected it. So here I am, talking about fighter pay when I said I would not keep talking about it. But I just could not believe some of this. Fellas, ladies, if you want the real money in the industry, you got to make them give it to you, not ask for it quite nicely.